Hello everyone, and welcome to the Grant Professionals Association's webinar. This webinar is titled Successful Grant Research, Finding RFPs that Meet Your Needs. My name is Kelly Romero, and I am the Membership Director for GPA and your webinar moderator for today. You are placed in listen-only mode, which means that your line is muted. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat box on the left side of your screen to submit your questions. We will get to as many questions as time permits throughout the webinar. You should have received the copies of the slides in the email invite where your dial-in information was. They are located on the right side of that email under Deliverables and Materials. At the end of this webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please stay on the line until you're directed to that survey so you can fill it out and assist us with our future webinars and provide us topics for future webinars, as well as give any critiques or kudos to the presenter. Today's presenter is Mandy Pearce, CFRE. Mandy launched Funding for Good in 2009 to equip nonprofits with the skills and tools they need to build successful and sustainable organizations. With 20 years of experience behind her, Mandy takes her passion for development and shares it with nonprofits through executive coaching, development seminars, and specialized programs. Her business model is centered on her key values: honesty, efficiency, direct communication, and bringing dollars to local communities. She lives in Hickory, North Carolina with her husband and their rescue lab mix, Leo, who share her enthusiasm for the outdoors. Mandy, we're so glad that you can join us to present this webinar. Please feel free to dial *7 if you haven't already to unmute your line and begin your presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Kelly. So good afternoon. I am Mandy Pearce, and I am glad you are all on with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about successful grant research. I know there's probably a wide variety of experience in the field online with us today, so hopefully I'm not talking above anybody's head or below anybody. We're just going to talk a little bit about some basic information that you need to know, need to be able to answer before you start doing research in order to do effective research. If you're new to the field, a lot of this is going to make perfect sense when you hear it. And if you've been in the field for a while, some of it might make sense and you knew it once but you forgot it, or maybe you're working in an organization that hasn't been using this type of information and it might be helpful for you so you can go out and start finding more prospects that really match what you need right now so you can write some grants and bring some dollars in for your organization. If you have a question as we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask it. Kelly's going to help me monitor the questions section of the chat box, and I will get to, as she said, as many questions as possible. If she wants to send me any additional questions after the fact that have come through that we haven't had a chance to answer, I will be happy to answer those through her and let her get back to everyone that was on the webinar with the answers. So we're going to talk about research. Hopefully you've all been doing some research and realized that money doesn't grow on trees. If it did, we wouldn't need to do grant research and we wouldn't need to do grant writing. So we have to find the perfect matches for the needs that we have. One of the first things that I always tell my students or my clients is the very first thing that you need to do before you start any grant research is to make a list of all of your current needs. It defeats the purpose to go do research if you're just trying to match foundation priorities with what your organization does, with your mission. For example, if your organization is focused on health in general, and you just go out and start searching for foundations that want to fund health initiatives, you're going to find a whole bunch of foundations that meet that criteria. But as you start calling them and building relationships and finding out what they support, you might very quickly realize, oh, this particular foundation wants to fund health, but they only fund preventative health. And maybe you don't do preventative health, so then it's not a good match. If you had originally had a list of needs and you knew what those were in very specific terms, then you would know whether or not the foundation's priorities were aligned with yours. The other thing that you need to be able to do with that list, have a list of what you need, and right beside it, a list of how many dollars you need for each one of those. Let's say you're a hospital and you need a high-fidelity birthing mannequin for your simulated hospital, and that's $100,000. Well, that's pretty specific information. If you go and you find a foundation who would support health and technology, but the most they give out at one time is $5,000, you might have to really think twice about, is that a good match for me? If you didn't know how much you were looking for, it would seem like a perfect match. It's very important to have those two pieces of information before you start doing any kind of research. Needs list, dollars associated with each need. The next thing you're really going to need to know is what type of support are you looking for. Some places have multiple needs all the time, and that's great, but you need to know what those types of support are. For example, if you're a hospital, you might have needs in lots of different departments. You might need to do renovations. Maybe you're building a new wing. Maybe you have a capital campaign. Maybe you also are doing a campaign to grow your endowment. So that's another type of need you have. Maybe you need to hire a new staff. So that could be capacity building or staff or general operating dollars. Maybe you need to buy equipment, like we just said. Maybe you need a high-fidelity birthing mannequin or a new mobile mammography unit or something else that's considered equipment. So, equipment can be lots of different things. It could be fixed equipment, such as heating and air, or it could be movable equipment, like pieces of technology you could take with you if you left. So maybe that's a computer or a transport x-ray machine or something to that effect. You have to know that there are lots and lots of different types of support, and you need to be able to figure out what your need fits into. So this is a very small list that you're looking at on the screen of types of support, and just know that as you start using maybe databases or looking online, there's going to be a lot more verbiage out there that you can also use. For example, if I'm doing a grant and I say I need project support, the difference in a program and a project is that a project is short-term and a program is long-term. But let's just say I'm project support. Well, there may be foundations that list that they like to support projects. There also might be foundations that list that they will support gen ops. And if they fund general operating and you were able to get those dollars, you could apply it to your project. Maybe your project also includes the purchase of some equipment. So instead of just looking for project grants, you could also look for foundations that support equipment purchases. Maybe your project is building the capacity of your organization or your program or project, and you could also look for capacity building grants. So there's not one specific category that each type of support will fit into unless it's something real specific like your endowment. Your endowment might not fit into a lot of different categories, and usually the organizations that will support an endowment say that specifically. You'd want to have that conversation with a program officer. Now, another very important piece of research is building a relationship with a program officer at the foundation. If you skip that step, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You need to either email or call, unless it is advised that you don't reach out to the foundation, which happens occasionally but not most of the time, and say, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, this is the project we have and how much we're looking to raise. We feel like we're probably a good fit with your foundation because we notice this is your priority. We see that for your 990s you've funded this type of thing in the past. Do you feel like your board might support this, or we would have a chance if we submitted an application, and then move forward? Those program officers can give you a wealth of information about what they will and won't fund, what they have historically supported, if the mindset or the current priorities of the board are, like we just said, in health. Maybe they say, right now in health we're really focused on community-centered health, or health in rural communities where there aren't a lot of primary care physicians, or we're really focused this year on preventative health. So having that conversation with a program officer can really lead you in the right direction of your research to say, this is a good prospect on paper, but when we get right down to it, they're probably not going to support what we're doing, so we should move on to a different prospect. The list that I have here of types of support, as you probably know, this is just a few. So we look at annual campaigns. There are prospects out there that say they will support an annual campaign. Building and renovation, you kind of need to know whether or not your building project is going to be from the ground up. Bricks and mortar is another way that that's often phrased. And a renovation is doing something on a building that already exists. It's very possible to have both of those in the same campaign. You could be building a new fellowship hall onto an existing church, so that would be a building, bricks and mortar, and you could be upgrading the sanctuary to be handicap accessible, and that would be a renovation. Some foundations want to support one but not the other, and knowing that ahead of time will let you know which one you need to request from them. Again, if you don't know what your specific needs are or the dollar amounts associated with them, you can't have that conversation effectively with the staff at the foundation. We talked a little bit about equipment, fixed or movable. Continuing support is just gen ops. General ops, we all want those. Land acquisition, there is money out there for that. In fact, I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday about the fact that there's also dollars out there for debt reduction. I worked with an organization that decided they wanted to buy a new piece of land, and they went and bought it because they had the money, but then they decided that now they didn't have money to do anything with the land because they spent the money they had, so they wanted to go out and find grants to pay for the land. And I said, well, that's not land acquisition anymore. That's debt reduction because you've already purchased it. So knowing that there are a variety of different types of funds out there will be helpful for you as you start doing research for your organization. There is a lot of grant money out there for research, but typically that is found on grants.gov if you're doing state and federal grants. Foundations do support research, so there is money available to nonprofits through foundations for research. Scholarship funds. Seed money is one of those things that there's two types. You can have seed money for a new organization. So if you're starting a new nonprofit or maybe you're just in your first 1 to 3 years, seed money is something that is available. However, seed money is not available for that as much as it used to be. These days, most foundations want to see 1, 3, 5 years of experience, successful programming, and growth before they will invest in an organization. Because while grants are still available, most foundations look at grants as an investment, and they want to know what the return on their investment is going to be. And if you're brand new, you can't share that with them. You have not got impact that you've kept up with and data and metrics to share about what you've done or what you're going to be able to do. So just know that there may be fewer dollars than there used to be available for seed money of new organizations. However, if your organization has been around for a while, let's just take Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, for example, and you start a new program within that organization, there's going to be lots of seed money for that. A couple of years ago, I was working with the Boy Scouts in Tennessee, and they were selected in Knoxville to do a pilot program for STEM scouting. There was a lot of money for STEM back then, but also a lot of support for the Boy Scouts because they've been around forever. Well, it was seed money because it was a new program, but they didn't have any problem raising it because they had been around for a long time. So just know that if you're going after seed money, it's to your benefit if you're working with an organization that's established. And then technical assistance and travel and those types of things. So I just encourage you to get online and look at some lists of different types of support and really be able to categorize the types of support you're looking for and know that before you start doing your research. There's 4 main funding sources. You need to be pretty familiar with all of them in order to do successful research. We have individuals, corporations, government, and foundations. And I know that we are not writing grants to individuals, but individuals fund over 70% of all the monies that come into nonprofits. So if you're a development officer and not a grant writer solely, then you need to be spending a great deal of time with your individual donors and working on that a lot. So for those of us that do a lot of grant writing, we're looking at corporations, government, and foundations more than anything. And within the government, we have federal, state, and local grants. When you do federal grant writing, you have to have a DUNS number, D-U-N-S. So if you don't have one of those, you'll need to apply for it, and it's free. You can get it online. It takes about 48, 72 hours to get that in hand. Federal grants are very time-consuming. Pretty sure some of the people online have probably written federal grants before, and I don't think anyone would disagree with me. There's not a real good way to build a relationship with folks through federal grant writing. You can email folks, you can call them and ask questions, but really you're not having a real relationship. You're not inviting them to see your program. Those things don't typically happen with federal grants. And you're spending a lot of time on those grants with potentially unsure return on investment. So we do write federal grants for a lot of clients, and the ones that get them are happy, and the ones that don't are frustrated because they spent so much time on them and money invested in them. But also you have to think government grants require a lot of grant management. So you have to make sure that the organization that you're working with is willing and capable of doing that grant management. Do they have the resources to put together those monthly reports? Can they function on a reimbursement basis if it's a reimbursement grant? Can they get a match if the agency or department of the federal government requires it? So federal government grants are a little bit cumbersome. And then we have foundations. So foundations come in the form of private, corporate, community, or family. And there's a lot of specifics we're going to look at within those. But for a minute, let's just go back to government, and I want to just inform everyone of how government grants come to be, in case you don't know. They are created by Congress through the enactment of public laws and appropriation of funds. So they follow a disbursement based on publicly announced rules. So you can go on grants.gov, and you can look at who's eligible, when the grants are due, how much you can request, how much they're going to fund, the specific things that they're going to fund. And they're funded by public contributions, aka taxes. And they're generally through annual legislative appropriations. So whoever's in office, whoever's in Congress and Senate and whatever, they're the ones that can voice what they want to be funded and what types of things they want these discretionary funds to be used for. So just know that not all federal grants are renewed every year. There are new federal grants constantly, and some of the ones that have been around for a long time end up disappearing over the course of time. So you can't rely on those grants on a regular basis. The appropriations are made by agencies and departments. So when you go on grants.gov, you can search by an individual agency or department. Like you can search by National Institutes of Health and see every grant they currently have open. You don't need to go to each individual website to find the grants that are available. You can just see them all on grants.gov. And then appropriations are also made on the state and local levels. So it's sort of a trickle down. The federal government will make an initiative and then pass it down to the state, and the state will pass it down to the local entities. So that's kind of how government grants work on a 50,000-foot level. Then we have corporations. A lot of people don't know that corporations have foundations, but even if they don't have a foundation, they typically give philanthropically. And they typically give through their marketing departments, not the philanthropic side. So corporations often want to require recognition for their funding because they want their name out there. So these are the folks that might say, are you going to put a plaque up? Are we going to get our name on the back of a T-shirt? Are you going to do a press release and announce that we supported you? Can we do a photo op with your board with a big check? They a lot of times will do gifts or goods or services instead of dollars. Dollars often come with sponsorships for events. And they do a lot of cause-related marketing, so products that are linked with a cause. Sometimes they do matching gifts. Corporations, I'm thinking about places like General Electric. They will match the gift of an employee to another nonprofit, or they will match the gift of a retired employee. W. Granger is a company that triple matches. So if one of their employees gives a gift, they will triple whatever that gift was. I used to have a donor that gave me $2,500 a year because Granger would triple match it with $7,500, so I got a $10,000 gift every year. It helps you to know the corporations that are in your area and what their philanthropic interests are, if they do grants or if they do giving or matching or whatever. And then employee workplace giving. We're all familiar with United Way and how they do that, or corporate volunteers. Some of the banks and other places will do corporate volunteering where if they have a certain number of staff that volunteer a certain number of hours, they will donate a certain number of dollars associated with that to a nonprofit. Private foundations are typically established to maintain or aid charitable activities serving the public good. They have a mission and a strategy just like you do as a nonprofit. They have to, required by law, give away 5% of their assets annually. Now, when the economy crashed back in 2008, 2009, a lot of folks were calling me saying there's not as much money as there used to be. Where do I go to find money? Well, it's not that there wasn't as much money as there used to be. It's that a lot of foundations lost money in the stock market, and they weren't required by law to give anything out. So while they technically had less money in the bank, it's not that there was less money. It's just that those grants were on hold until they started making money again. So they can only fund tax-exempt organizations. Have lots and lots of people calling me as individuals saying, hey, I own a dry cleaning company and I need to buy green equipment. Can I get a grant for that? Maybe if there was something through the federal government for small business initiatives or green initiatives, but typically not through a foundation because legally they are only allowed to fund tax-exempt organizations. A foundation cannot just say, I'm going to write a check to my next-door neighbor because I know they need a new roof. That's not how it works. They give through grants. Typically, grants are time-limited. And a lot of people don't understand that foundations have to file 990s just like nonprofits do. Their 990 is called a 990-PF for private foundation. And just like we have to file our taxes at a certain time every year to say how much we made the year before and how we spent it, private foundations have to do the same thing. So when you turn in your report at the end of the year and say, this is what we did with the money, they are then allowed to say who they gave the money to and what the money was used for, and they do that on their 990-PF. So if you're late getting your reports back to them, it in turn makes them late getting their 990s filed. I don't know if anybody's ever been online looking at 990s for grant research. I do that all the time. But if you've ever been on and you're like, oh my gosh, why don't we have 990s for 2014 or 2015 for this organization? Well, it's probably because they had to file for an extension, and it might be because some of their grantees haven't returned their end-of-year reports yet, and so they haven't been able to file. So I encourage you to, make sure you're getting your stuff in on time. And they are typically managed by trustees or boards of directors. Now, corporate foundations, as the name implies, are funded by major corporations. So think Target Foundation, Walmart Giving Foundation, the Verizon Wireless Foundation, Enterprise Rent-A-Car Foundation. A lot of major corporations have formal foundations. And again, their annual contributions vary relative to the profit of the company. And they typically give in communities where there is a corporate presence. So 2 things to keep in mind here. One, you need to know the corporations that are in your area. You also need to know the corporations that are in surrounding areas. Because a lot of places say in a community where they have a presence or in a community where their employees live or within a 30-mile or a 50-mile radius of a facility. Now, a facility doesn't mean a storefront. It could be a warehouse, or it could be a packaging facility, or a corporate office, or a storefront. So you have to know the things that are in your area to know the folks that you're going to qualify for requesting funds from. You can find some of that information online when you're searching through grant databases, but again, it's helpful if you know who's in your community. Now, here's the other thing. You need to know who's leaving your community. So if you see people that are like, oh, we're moving our headquarters to, 5 towns away or to the next state or whatever, then maybe that's a time to be worried, like, oh, we always get money from that organization. Will they still fund us if they're not in our area? A lot of times the answer is no. So, that's where keeping in touch with program officers and building those relationships will allow you to stay informed for you and for the organizations that you support. Then you have community foundations. Those are funded by contributions from numerous individuals and families. It's often a pool of money made up of donor-advised funds, and they often limit their grants to their community or communities that they serve. They provide aid to local charities in grant-seeking and matching funds. It's different in every state, but I'm calling from North Carolina and talking to you today from North Carolina. So in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Community Foundation, which serves 67 of our 100 counties. And then we have the Community Foundation of Western North Carolina, which serves 18 foundations there, or counties there. We have the Foundation for the Carolinas, which is headquartered in Charlotte and covers a couple more counties in Charlotte and South Carolina. And then we have a couple of independent foundations, which are specific to one county. So it's helpful to know that type of information in the state that you're in to know who you can go to and qualify for funding depending on where the organization is situated. Then we have family foundations. And I am going to read a question real quick that just popped up. I'm on a couple of committees that function as nonprofits, but they don't have a 501c3. To apply for grants, we have to go through our local community foundation. However, some grant guidelines say you can't go through a fiscal agent. Any ideas of how to get around this or do it a better way? The only two things that come to mind immediately for that question are, one, partnering with another nonprofit and writing the grant collaboratively, and the other nonprofit being the person that applies. Depends on the type of project you're doing. So if you're not doing a project that allows for collaboration, then that won't be an option. And if that's not an option, getting your 501c3 is the next way to go, because a lot of foundations do not like pass-through funds, which is what that's technically called. They want to know that the organization they give the money to is the one that's going to be utilizing it. And so, again, building a relationship with a program officer and explaining to them who and why is requesting it and who and why is utilizing it will be beneficial. But obviously we don't have time to go into a lot of detail about why your organization is not a 501c3, but if it's going to be around for a while and you hope to grow and build your capacity, it might make sense to go ahead and start the paperwork to get your 501c3 so you do qualify for some of those funds. Good question. Family foundations are funded by contributions from individual benefactors or families, and it's often established by a substantial bequest upon the death of the founder. It is important for you to find out if the person that started that family foundation is still living, and this is why. A lot of times, family foundations, if the person that founded it is still alive, they can change their priorities from year to year. They can fund anything they want all the time, and they don't have to stick with the same type of thing. If it is a family foundation that was formed upon the death of someone, a lot of times, again, not all the time, but a lot of times, what they wanted to fund is written into their will or their bequest or whatever, and it can't be changed. For example, I don't know how many people on the line have heard of the Duke Endowment. It's one of the largest foundations in the country, and Mr. Duke had very specific things he wanted to support, which cannot be changed. They can be tweaked, and here's the example of why. He wanted to support orphanages in the state of North Carolina. That was one of his priorities. Well, we don't really have quote-unquote orphanages anymore, but we do foster care, which is the next closest thing to what he was referencing as an orphanage. So the board of directors for the Duke Endowment has tweaked what they support to be in as close of alignment as possible with what Mr. Duke's wishes were. They couldn't say, oh, well, we don't really have orphanages anymore, so we're going to support the local humane society, because that has nothing to do with orphanages. So you need to know, is it possible for them to change their funding priorities every year? And if they do, and you have a good relationship with the program officer, you need to be having conversations with them on a regular basis to say, what are you guys supporting this year? Here's an example of why. When I used to work in Charlotte, North Carolina, we had a foundation that had supported the American Lung Association every year at a pretty nice level. Well, that particular family had a medical emergency with one of the family members, and as a result, decided that they were going to start supporting the Kidney Foundation, which made perfect sense to me because of the situation with the family. And we had a conversation about it. They explained to me why. And I said, you know what, I completely understand that. Now, they still supported us at a very small level every year, but at least I was able to understand why they changed their priorities. We had that conversation because we had built a relationship, and I knew I had to go out and find someone else to replace that particular donor. If you don't keep in contact with people on a regular basis and you don't know that they've changed their priorities, you might be thinking, oh, we'll just go back to such and such a foundation because we haven't gotten money from them in a while. You cannot assume that a family foundation will support the same things every year just because they supported one particular thing 3 years ago. So I encourage you to make sure that you are aware of who started it and why, and from year to year what their priorities are. So contributions often have a significant, if not total influence on, or contributors often have a significant, if not total influence on the awards. Small family foundations are often staffed by an attorney, or they're staffed by something we like to call the gatekeeper, somebody that fields emails and phone calls and, kind of answers questions, or maybe they don't have a formalized online application process. You have to go through someone, aka the gatekeeper, to say this is what we're doing, could we apply? And if they say yes, they'll send you an application or they'll send you a link to apply. And they often don't solicit proposals, which means they don't have an online application. Now, this is a little worksheet. I'm not sure if you guys can download the slides, but I would think you can if they were accessible before the webinar. This is a little worksheet that I give clients in my classes to say, if you can fill this out, you're probably ready to start your grant research. What is your geographic focus? So where in the country are you looking? Is it in a particular city or town? Is it in a county? Is it in a multi-county area or a region of the state? Is it the whole state, a region of the country, or the whole country? So what is your geographic focus for your grants? Because a lot of times you can do research based on who funds religious schools in Georgia. And you can start narrowing down your research. But if you cover multiple states, then maybe you're searching in a different way. You need to know your fields of interest. For example, if you work in the mental health field, that's one field of interest, mental health. Maybe you also specifically work with people who have developmental disabilities, so that's a second area. And maybe within developmental disabilities, you work with clients who are autistic, so that's a third field of interest. So then also, maybe you don't just work with the clients, but you work with families, so that's a fourth field of interest. So you need to really be able to list what are all the areas that I could potentially look for, because there's lots of different searches you can do online. If you go online and search grants in the state of Texas for mental health organizations working with developmentally disabled autistic families, you're probably not going to find very much. But if you go online and search grants in Texas for mental health, you'll get a bunch. Grants in Texas for developmental disabilities, you'll probably get some. So there's a lot of different ways to do those searches, and as some of us know, if you've ever been on eBay, for example, the more you put into the search field, typically the fewer responses you get, the broader you make it, the more you get. So being able to have a couple of different fields of interest to work within will be helpful for you. And then as we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, knowing what type of support that you need will be really helpful. So are you looking for general ops? Are you looking for programs or projects? Are you looking for endowment support? Are you looking for capital dollars? And then what are the amounts associated with those? So I encourage you, for each major program or project or organization that you're looking to write grants for, that you fill this out, and you'll probably need to update it on a regular basis. As your needs list changes, as you start bringing funding in or eliminating needs, then you want to have a new sheet to fill out. And then we want to start looking at where do we do the research. Well, you can go to the library. In a lot of places, the Foundation Center has software in libraries that you can go in and utilize for free. It's a paid service if you get it at your house or your office, but a lot of libraries have it for free. So you can go on Foundation Center's website and do a little search and find out if there's a library close to you. I worked with our local community library here in North Carolina where I live last year in the summer and told them the value of the software, explained to them what all folks could do with it, and asked them if they would be willing to invest in that. And after the course of about 3 or 4 months, they got approval. After another couple of months, they got it established, and now it's there for the whole community to use. So, sometimes having conversations with folks about that will lead to the ability for you to have access to it. I encourage you to look at office files if you're working in an office setting. I'm a consultant, so I don't really have that opportunity, but when I used to be a development director, every time I would work in an organization, I would want to look at what grants did you write previously? Which ones did you get? Which ones did you not get? How much were they for? Who did you build a relationship with? Doing some of that work ahead of time will let you know who you should be calling, who you should be reconnecting with, who you shouldn't be calling. You don't want to call somebody who said, we don't support what your organization does, so we don't want to fund you. You don't want to be that person that calls them the next year and, hey, I really feel like we're a good fit, and them be like, yeah, we already told you we don't want to fund you. At the same time, you don't want to not call someone who says, this year that's not really our focus, but be sure to give us a call back next year, and then not call them back. So A lot of people don't keep paper copies of office files, but I'm going to say to you I encourage it. I also encourage keeping a digital copy because I worked with an organization for about 8 years that moved offices. One year they moved office after about 7 years of grant writing with them, and they lost some of their file boxes that had grants in them. So they lost some of their grants. If we hadn't had those grants digitally, we couldn't have made copies to replace them. And then the year after that, unfortunately, they had to move again. And one of their computers crashed during that and was unrecoverable. So they lost a lot of their electronic copies. Luckily, I had a thumb drive to replace those, but they also had the hard copies to back them up if they needed to look something up and they hadn't already received the electronic copies. So I encourage you wherever you are to let your clients or you as a staff know that you need copies, digital and hard copies. Talk to people in similar programs. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, that's competition, but that's the wrong mindset. Talk to people and find out, what did you do with your fundraising that was effective? Who did you go to for support through grants? Was it a national organization that might have a local affiliate that would support us? Was it a local company that likes what we do? Maybe you do something similar to someone else in your area, but you do it in a different way, or you serve a different region of the area or whatever. You know, you should be partnering to find out what has been successful for other people. Internet, a lot of us are going to go to the internet, and that's where we're going to start our research. The only thing I'll tell you about that is, A, it's very time consuming, but B, you're going to have to do it, and C, a lot of small foundation websites are not updated on a regular basis. So take the information that you find, but be sure to follow up with a program officer to find out if that information is still accurate. Networking, I find out about all kinds of grant opportunities when I'm networking. I go to free networking events, lunch and learns, Chamber of Commerce events, all kinds of opportunities to meet people, because everybody's writing grants for different things, and everybody finds grants in different ways or knows people on different boards, works at different companies. So I encourage you, I always tell my clients, you need to be at least one networking event a month. It doesn't have to be a paid event, but you need to be out there. The more people who know what you're doing and what you're trying to have funded, the more people can talk about it for you, can refer you to other people, can help you make connections in the community. It might not happen immediately, but you might have the result 4 weeks later, 4 months later, and you just have no idea. I was sitting at a Jason's Deli once with a client talking about a grant for a big project that we were writing, and, you know, we were just chit-chatting about it, talking. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, we received a $5,000 check from someone that we never solicited. Well, it's because they were in the same restaurant listening to our conversation, had an interest in it, and were part of the foundation and just decided to help support it. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen to you every day, but the more you're out networking, the more people that know what you're doing, the better opportunity you have of that. And then seminars and workshops. So, you know, go to free workshops. If you have a small business center, community college that does free things, online training, be educating yourself regularly so you can learn some of the tricks of the trade for whatever you're doing in grant writing, especially with research. And some of those are free and some of them are not. I encourage people to be doing at least one development something every quarter for yourself professionally. Now, here's a list of questions that you need to consider before you start your grant research. Does your program or project fall within the donor funders area of interest, or can you make it fall in their area of interest? Where will your program or project have an impact? That is a very different question than your service area or your geographic focus, okay? You could be working with a water keeper, river keeper somewhere, and you could work on one section of the river. That's your service area. But you're going to have an impact on that section of the river and everything downstream, depending on the type of work you're doing. So your impact area is much greater. Does the average grant size fit your need? I was working on a grant for a ballet school a couple of years ago, and they needed to purchase a marley floor, which is that really soft black stuff that dancers dance on. And it was a little bit less than $3,500, so it wasn't a huge grant at all. But we went to the North Carolina Arts Council because they had a grant that fit funding what we needed. Well, the only thing was they said their typical grant amount was $5,000 to something else, like $5,000 to, I don't remember, $12,000 or something. And so I called the program officer and said, can you tell me if there's any reason why we couldn't apply for less than $5,000? Like, we only need $3,500. She's like, oh, no, your request has to be at least $5,000. So it's helpful to know what their funding priority for dollars are. And if you're going to an organization for $5,000 that typically funds $50,000 to $75,000 grants, that might not be a good fit for you or for them. And vice versa. If you're going to somebody who typically funds $1,000 to $2,500 grants, then you need $10,000 or $20,000. It's probably not going to make a huge impact on your actual project. They may not be willing to fund that. Then you need to know if they're going to be requiring a match. So a lot of foundations like matches. Some of them require matches. And state and federal grants do the same thing. If that's the case, how much are they requesting? And does the match have to be dollar for dollar? Or can it be an in-kind match, like space, equipment, personnel, that kind of thing? And then are you comfortable with the fact that you'll be able to secure that match? Do you have a place you can go? Do you have a donor who's willing to be your leverage? Can you leverage the funding? Are funds paid up front, or it is a reimbursement grant? It's probably only going to come up if you're working with federal grant applications. But if you are, you need to know if it's a reimbursement grant, and if it is, can your organization handle that? You need to have several months of operating in the bank in order to be able to do that effectively. So that's a good question to ask and a good question to have with the board to make sure that they're willing to do it. You definitely don't want to write a grant for somebody and then tell them after the fact, oh, by the way, this is a reimbursement grant. So you need to have a couple of months of money in the bank. You also need to know, and you need to educate the people you work with, the executive directors you work with, the boards that you work with, that grants can take 6 to 9 months to acquire. It is not a process. I know that most of you have heard people say, oh, let's just go get a grant for that. Like it's the super easiest thing in the world, and why can't we just get a grant for everything? I'm sure some of you are sitting in your chairs laughing right now like, yes, I've heard that before. You need to let them know, yes, there's some grants we're going to get in a month. There's some private foundations that know us really well, and they're going to say, here's your check. But that is not the norm. By the time you locate a grant, write a grant, submit it, wait to find out if you got funding, sign a contract, and then have a check sent, it can take 9 months. If you're working with state and federal grants, it can take longer than that. We finished a grant like 3 or 4 months ago for a client that was a federal research grant for the National Institutes of Health, and literally it's been 4 months since we submitted it. He won't find out until October if he gets it, and if he gets it, he won't get the money until January. So it's almost a 1-year process for that grant. And then if you're able to wait the long amount of time it takes, will it come in time for your need? So let's say your project starts in August and the foundation says, oh, we write our checks in September. The first question in my head is, if I spend money on that project before we get your grant money, can we reimburse ourselves for what we've already spent out of the grant dollars you give us? And a lot of times they'll say yes, and a lot of times they'll say no. When they say no, it's usually you can't spend any of the money until you get the check from us. So if you do spend money, you can't reimburse yourself from what we send you. So then it's really a question of, can we wait on that grant to do the project? Do we want to wait on that grant to do the project? So knowing deadlines is extremely helpful. And then you need to know if there are restrictions, like they don't fund faith-based organizations, or they don't fund transportation, or they don't fund private schools or universities or endowments or whatever. And all of those things are available to you, well, most of those things are available to you in the grant guidelines, which is the instructions for the grant. So just a few last things to remember. It's our job as grant writers to be proactive, to do the research, to look at the 990s, to read foundation websites, to make sure we have all the answers we can possibly find, and then to reach out to the foundation and start building that relationship before we start writing a grant. Address funders' priorities, their concerns, their values. You know, it's really all about the donor when you go to have that conversation. You want it to be all about you, and I understand that feeling, but when you have the conversation, you need it to be all about them. Have realistic expectations. Even if a foundation says to you, oh, that sounds like a really good project, we funded that kind of thing in the past, I really encourage you to put an application in, and I think you should request $65,000. A, that's great, but B, that doesn't mean that you're going to get the money. And if you get any money, it doesn't mean you're going to get $65,000. it is the programs officer's job to be the liaison between the foundation and the organization, to learn as much as they can about the organization so they can answer questions to the board when they're reviewing applications and want to know about your program or your projects. So have realistic expectations. Just because you're encouraged to apply doesn't mean you're going to get funded. And make sure your board knows the same thing. Educate yourself on the organization you are working with before you make a call to them. So this is a really great opportunity for you guys to ask some questions if you have any. I know that was a lot of information. Not really sure what questions you might have.
If there is a question, please feel free to type them in the chat box, or you can actually, there should be like a raise your hand button, and you can raise your hand and we'll get your line unmuted so you can ask your question verbally.
Perfect. And while you guys are doing that, if anybody has a question, I'm going to go ahead and tell you about the next slide. If anybody is interested in having research done for your organization, or you'd like some help so you can actually get a list of prospects that really fit your current needs so you can go ahead and start writing grants and communicating with foundations, we have an offer for you because you're a GPA member. You can get $100 off grant research with Funding for Good between now and June 17th. You just need to take that code GPA Research to the checkout with you at fundingforgood.org/grant-research, and we will be happy to do that for you. Usually have a 2 to 3 week turnaround time, and you will get a lovely thumb drive with at least 8 to 10 prospects that match your current needs so you can go ahead and start reaching out to folks. So I just wanted to do this to say thank you for you guys having me on as a guest presenter today, and if anybody has a question about that, you're welcome to call me. And you can also find my contact information on the website, or you can email me at mandy@fundingforgood.org. And I would love to talk with any of you, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. And then if anybody does have questions after the fact or after we're done, you can email them over to me, and I can get them over to Mandy. Or you can contact Mandy from her website or the phone number that is on your screen right now. Okay, I do see a question. Mandy, what's the average time it takes you to find the perfect grant opportunity for a client?
It really depends on the need. Sometimes we have clients that have really obscure things they're wanting to fund, and so it depends. If this is something that's in the normal realm of things that foundations want to support, I would say 1 to 2 weeks, depending on if I'm in the office to do the research. And then we edit all the research and highlight the things they need to know, provide them with contact information in that 90 so they can do background research themselves before they contact a foundation. And again, we typically try to find 8 to 10. Sometimes we find more, but that's usually a 2 to 3 week turnaround time at the most. And if it's really obscure, I would know that when we read the research questionnaire, and we'd have a conversation with the prospect to begin with and say, okay, this is really an unusual request, or I don't think, like the guy that wanted debt reduction. Because of the area where he lives, because of the type of facility that it is, because of the service they provide, he's probably not going to find many foundations, if any foundations, who will support that. And I told him that. And he went to another grant professional in the area that I know and that person told him the exact same thing. So I don't try to tell people, oh, I can find grants for anything in the world, but I'm very honest with people and say it really depends on what the need is. I work with a hospital, and we do all their grant writing and research, and they come to us with grants that typically, capital projects for hospitals are easy to get funded. Equipment purchases for hospitals are easy to get funded. So those types of things aren't hard to find grants for, and actually sometimes it's, okay, I need to limit it to 20. I don't need to give them 50 grants they qualify for right now. So it really depends on what they're looking for. What is the best timing to establish contact with a grantor you are preparing an application for? So in the question itself, I say it really is, you shouldn't be preparing an application for someone until you've had a conversation with them. Unless they say in their guidelines, phone calls to the foundation are discouraged or something like that, you should never start working on an application until you have talked to a foundation and at least have some feeling that the project you're proposing is a really good match, or they would be interested in seeing your proposal, or they encourage you to apply. Because just because you and I think it's a perfect fit on paper might not be when you actually call them. So my rule of thumb is never to start on a grant application until I've talked to someone at the foundation. I am working with a nonprofit with a capital campaign for a building renovation and bricks and mortar and several programs tied to the capital project. I've started gathering the data, needs, and timeline and costs. The project is 1.5 years to break ground. What would you suggest as the next step? Well, you need a diversified fundraising stream, and you need a plan for who you're going to go to for grants, who you're going to go to for business sponsors, and who you're going to go to for individual major donors. And that is a process that, depending on how big your organization is, how big the capital campaign is, should probably happen 6 months before you start fundraising. The last capital campaign I did was about $2.5 million, and we spent about 4 or 5 months before we kicked off the campaign securing donors and coming up with that list. And then once we got started, it took us 8 months to finish it because we had laid the groundwork really well before we started. So that would be my suggestion. Where are you getting capital and equipment project funding for hospitals? Lots of different places. You know, we do research for that client and write grants for them on a regular basis and have for a while, but there's tons of folks out there that do that. And, you know, again, it depends on the area where you are and the foundations in your area. I have a client in Dallas, Texas, who has a bazillion foundations available to them. And, you know, I have a client in a very small town in North Carolina that has foundations available to them, but not nearly the amount that a organization in Dallas, Texas would. So it really depends on where you're looking for the dollars. Do you find that clients are impatient about the research process, and then maybe they just expect you to hand them money? How do you deal with that? I don't find that clients are impatient about the research process, because if I have a filled out research questionnaire from them, it doesn't take me more than 2 or 3 weeks to do it. So as long as I set their expectations in the beginning and say it could take me 2 to 3 weeks to finish this, then no, they shouldn't be impatient. And then I also educate them on the grant process beforehand and make them very aware of this is the process. You can't just do research and expect to have money in hand tomorrow. And part of that is a conversation with the client beforehand to say, what are your expectations? And when do you need this money in hand? If they say to me, we need this money in 4 months, my first comment out of my mouth is, okay, that's not realistic. So if you're wanting grants for that, that's not realistic. If you want to go to major donors, or you want to go to business sponsors, or you want to have a special event, then maybe. But to get grants and know that they're going to be secured, you've got to find grants that the timeline that applications are available is in that time frame. And then you have to make sure they're going to be determining who's getting funded within that time frame, and that's not realistic. So a lot of that is conversations that happen, you know, before we ever take on clients or as we work with clients. And it's just educating them on the reality of the situation and making sure their expectations are appropriate. Great questions.
Yeah, those are really good. Thank you, everyone, for asking them. I don't see any more questions there. So like we said, if you do have a question, Mandy's phone number is on the screen, or you can go to our website, or you can send me an email at Kelly, and that's Kelly with an I, at grantprofessionals.org, and I will direct them over to Mandy. Okay, so Mandy, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I can't think of anything, but I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad everyone was interactive, and I hope they got a lot out of it today.
Perfect. Okay, well, that concludes our webinar. We'd like to ask each of you to remain with us a few moments longer and complete the short survey you see on your screen. Take a moment to evaluate the webinar and provide us with future topics, as well as, like I said, give kudos or critique, and we'd appreciate it. Mandy, we'd like to thank you for your time and willingness and all your expertise and information that you've shared today. Also, thanks to all of you who have attended. We're so glad that you can join us, and we hope that this session was helpful for you. Tomorrow morning, you will receive a recorded version of this webinar. via email, and it'll look like the same email that you guys got for the dial-in information. The link to the recording will be on that email. Please feel free to refer back to it at any time. And also remember that this webinar does qualify you for 1 credit towards GPC CEUs. So make sure you take advantage of that. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks for joining.